Well, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Sue Craig from Tintina Consultants, and I'm just your MC to introduce these amazing panels and presentations we have this morning. So I know you want to hear from them, so I'm just going to start. Our first panel is on the Yukon land claims, discovering the principles of the, sorry, the heart of Chapter 22 in the final agreements. And I will let the panelists introduce themselves, and it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So thank you for all being here.
Good morning. Yakayatsu Tarahonig on Chish Katuan. I'd just like to say good morning. I'm Peter Johnson, a member of the Teslin Council. I was first elected as Grand Chief in 2016 and on my third and last term. But however, I was also as a member of the Teslin First Nation, my father was chief, but also one of the signatories to Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, which now we are celebrating the 50th anniversary, which is a monumental year for us, looking back over the last 30 years of implementation, but more importantly and more excitingly, if you will, is what's the next 30 years of implementation look like for us. And some of the discussion today hopefully will be led through Chapter 22 in the Economic Development Portfolio. So thank you. Chish.
I'm Greg Story. I'm an educator for 37 years, mostly in fly-in communities in the north. And I've noticed a few things in that time. I think we can do better with our system. I think the thing that probably helped me the most being an educator was that my father was a farmer. He had grade 4. He decided that all of his kids would go into the education system, but he also taught me how to do all the stuff that farm kids can do. And when I became a teacher, it was very easy for me to move into experiential education with students and northern students, and that seemed to be an extremely good fit, and I think is at least part of the answer in how we can do a better job in education. Thank you.
So my name is Tony Pennicat. I was once a temp with the Yukon government, and I was in that capacity, found myself at the land claims table back in the 80s when we were struggling to get an agreement, not just a land claims agreement, which I would tell people here is so significant, it's on a scale that there is more land in the Yukon land claim settlement than there is in all of the Indian reserves in southern Canada put together for 500,000 people. 7,000 people here have 41,000 square miles of land which they own. The second part of the agreement, though, of that agreement was the self-government powers. Almost alone among First Nations in Canada, Yukon First Nations can, if they choose to exercise them, have quasi-provincial powers, which means in case of mining, which we're going to talk about, they own surface rights and subsurface rights and have considerable powers about how they can use those lands. We're going to focus today on Chapter 22, which is the economic chapter of that agreement, of those agreements. But in particular, for this audience, we want to focus on Clause 22.4.22 of the umbrella fund of Chapter 22, which is actually specific about mining. And what happened when we went to the table in the mid-80s, after there had been a previous agreement in 1984 that got rejected, and we went back to the table in 85 with a new government. I led a government which was fairly unique in the territory in the sense that half of our caucus were Indigenous leaders, and the other half were young people who had spent much of their life in mining towns, some of whom are here today. And we didn't have a common understanding of a lot of issues, but we learned from each other very quickly, as we had to, in this process. And among the leaders in my caucus were Peter's father, Sam Johnson, who was the first Indigenous speaker of any legislature in the British Commonwealth. So very, very important moment in time. So let me tell you briefly about Chapter 22, and we'll get into it. Chapter 22 said, that we needed to do, as Greg said, a different method of teaching and training for kids for the jobs that were going to emerge in the Yukon economy. And the chiefs came to us and said, it's not fair that in Yukon mines there are almost no First Nation people working in them. And that was not just a problem because First Nation people don't like shift work, because it disrupts family life. They often, even though the villages were very close to mines, it was annoying having to commute every day to work. But what was really significant was if they got jobs at all, and Peter won't mind me saying this, it tended to be summer jobs, sweeping in the mill or that, rather than careers. And what we all wanted was to see a situation where young First Nation people, men and women, could actually get careers in the mining industry. So we didn't know how to approach this until some of us heard about an experiment going on in Manitoba, northern Manitoba. And it was led by a very brilliant young deputy minister, later a minister, 27 years of age, Rhodes Scholar, very clever. He went in to do the community benefits discussions with all the communities around a huge mega project, a 10-year-long construction project of a limestone hydro dam. And he went to the communities and said, we want to provide some benefits. We don't want to just be here and disrupt your lives. What is it that you want? And those leaders in those communities said, we want jobs and we want training. So they said, no problem, we will agree to that right now. Then they went to the situation of looking at the educational level of the people in these communities, northern communities, and most of them didn't have what the government there said you had to have, grade 7, grade 8, 9, whatever, to get into apprenticeships. And so they had to go from scratch to redesign the apprenticeship program based on indigenous traditions, which is experiential learning. You don't learn from books, you learn from doing. You learn from elders who have skills already. In the same tradition of European tradition where the great cathedrals, beautiful cathedrals in Europe were built by a man who would then train his son, usually his son, and then that son would train the next generation. It might take 3 generations to complete that building. But that's how people learn. They learn by doing. So we wrote a clause in chapter 22, 422, which actually said the government will do this kind of training or foster it or fund it, somehow make it happen. I have to say, and I'm ashamed to say, that 30-some years later, nothing has been done on that clause. And because the government didn't do it, some of us, private citizens now, decided to begin a conversation about that in mail. So we have going on, I'll show you it later, a kind of chain letter conversation going on. One person would make one point, another person make another point. And these two gentlemen, Peter has been very keen about leading the discussion about that inside the Indigenous community. Greg, with his education experience in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and here, and as a superintendent here, is well positioned to help foster the conversation inside the education community. So that's what we're all about today. I'm going to start by talking to Peter, and a challenging question that he'll find very hard to answer, which is, when you were being taught how to trap and cut wood, did you go to school and learn that from a grade 1 teacher? Or did you learn it from someone who knew what they were doing?
It was passed down, right? And I think today how important it is for my kids to learn that same skill, but I'm pushing it on them now, I think, even in my, to understand what it takes to become, not only a person that can look after themselves, but I think, trying to force these things onto people today, including my kids, is not necessarily the answer either. So we have to do it in a way where they don't even know they're doing it, I think, in certain cases. And a lot of cases when it comes to leadership, and regardless if you're in political or whatever profession you're in, the more that you just do it and become more familiar with it, the easier it becomes, right? And I think as we look at self-government here in the territory, after 30 years of implementation, it's easier now, I think, than it was 30 years ago, even to come into this room, which I not struggle with, but I think a lot of our people still do struggle with, and let alone the women. And it's a male-based ego industry. There's a lot of gray-haired old men in this industry as well, and I think it's the pivotal changes are happening, and I think the more that we could see ourselves in there. But I mean, we're struggling with the fact that we weren't even allowed to work in this territory till the 60s, right? So there's a lot of different elements here. 1492, a lot of that was based on greed, and we were unfortunately the outcome of a negative experience as well. So there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. I think the fact that we have within my community, there's male individuals that are 18 to 30 that don't have employment, don't have any meaningful place to work, let alone the fact that when the premier stands up and he says we got the best a booming economy, low unemployment, he doesn't look at the 200 people that are in the street downtown Whitehorse, let alone those young individuals that are in my community that are not being looked upon as being an asset, where today in today's economy, that age group, 18 to 30, I think are pivotal, and not only in regards to learning those skills, as Tony mentioned, but the transfer of that knowledge as we go on. And I worry about that to a certain degree, where we're going and how much of this knowledge is being retained. So, thank you.
So, Peter, let me ask you another trick question. Tantalus Butte, you may remember, is a mine up near Carmax, where they were digging coal to keep the Faro mine operating. Had an entire indigenous workforce. Why was that possible there and not possible in the other mines in the Yukon?
Because I think it was just concentrated effort in regards to a program or a situation that people saw the benefit of that. And I think there's other good examples of that, same synergies that could be developed, but I think it does take not only leadership and but also momentum in regards to building these. And there's a lot of great examples of a lot of great companies that are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, if you will, but even doing more than they have to, not only to encourage, but also to ensure that their objectives or their are being met as well. So I think there is a lot of, with creativity, we could do a lot in this room, let alone in this world.
Well, the Manitoba experience is really interesting because they succeeded in actually, as they promised, in leaving behind in every one of the northern communities a electrician, carpenter, plumber, indigenous people, all trained by the experiential process and able to function in the community. Now, there were problems in the sense that, unlike the Yukon, northern Manitoba communities don't have roads between them. So you might have an electrician in one community who was a stranded asset because there was no work for them at the time. That was a problem. But the thing that Manitoba did in making mining a designated trade, which you could learn by experiential processes, was a success story, because 10 years later, when I was doing uranium mine negotiations in northern Saskatchewan, there were crews there, were totally indigenous crews working on those sites. And I think there are things we can learn from that process. So let me say, you're an extremely experienced, extremely successful politician, Peter. Well, you're always successful until the day you actually leave.
I'm still here, so
yeah.
Appreciate that.
Why do you think, as an experienced politician, we have failed here at the government level to take any action to make this happen here, even though it's in the treaty? I mean, a treaty is not a hint. It's not a suggestion. It's not a regulation. It's not a law. It is actually the supreme law of the land, which elected people have an obligation to implement. But it has not happened here. What's your theory about why that is?
Well, it's typical government, and I apologize if the premier and his cabinet, or even, it's just the way the world works. And I think a lot of that is the investment looked upon as, do we want to invest there, right? Is there, when we look at investing in Indigenous and First Nation people, is there a return in our investment? For sure, in our governments and our communities, those returns are very much looked upon as being in very high regard. But from a government perspective, how do you value people in your society, right? And unfortunately, within First Nation context, we're just finally coming into this place, like I said, where we're not only looked upon as being a sense of value, but now with the opportunity we have to not only be successful in regards to where we're going, I think it's even a more emphasis on how do we ensure that we don't leave anyone behind. Because today the education system, unfortunately, is leaving a lot of people behind. So a lot of these young men that I talk about, and it's not all about the men, but I feel that we're not meeting people halfway when it comes to the education system. We're dealing with an education system that isn't even relevant to us today in the sense of what the objectives that we want to create here in the territory. The more on land-based experiences or experiences that Greg will talk about as well. Those are the ones that we need as First Nation people, hands-on, very tactile, if you will, that we can not only learn from that, but that is who we are as First Nation people. We're very much on the land, but learning from example, but also from the constant having to cut that wood, and especially in the colder months, you're cutting wood almost every day. So 10,000 times they say, and so I'm an expert woodcutter too as well, Tony. So thank you.
So I don't want to put you in an embarrassing spot, but yes, I do.
Okay.
If you were premier now, how would you go about seeing 22.422 was implemented?
Well, National Chief Matthew Kunkam once said, with self-government without an economic base is a mirage. And I think the basis of Chapter 22 and the vision was to create this autonomy, let alone this independence through financial wealth. And I think we've done very well, I think, in the last 30 years. And if you look at not only this building, but such good examples such as, Air North, for instance, where the equity is sharing with the Bantakuchin. Those platforms we need to ensure that good investment is being made for the financial gain, which will eventually fund our governments. Right now, we're struggling with even just having enough resources to satisfy, our education demands with the younger generation coming up to seek higher education and stuff. So I think once we get to those places where economic development through Chapter 22 and these partnerships, because when we talk about our agreements, the basis of it is based on partnership, that we know that we can't do things on ourselves or alone here, and very similar to government who likes to do things on their own and independently and very much linear thinking, which big shout out to Kim Hudson, because she taught me how important it is to have linear thinking, let alone circular thinking, and how do we develop things in that possibility. And I think government is very linear to where they see like a dog on the bone and don't really care. They'll do a little bit of consultation, where we as First Nation and governments, particularly my government in Teslin, is about bringing more people into the conversation to ensure that when we develop a housing policy or whatever it may be, that we all understand that we do have that ability to create that. So I think today with the partnerships, and we see many of them, and I think even within the last couple of years, we saw a very strong concerted effort by companies here in the room that see the benefit of working with First Nations, not only for the employment aspect, but also the fact that they can now move into places in our communities and feel a little bit more sense of community. And I think really what we all want at the end of the day as First Nation government is to build that sense of community. And how do we ensure that government services, which have been taken away, and back when you were premier, certain things such as airports were very important to my community in Teslin, where it employed 6 people with a little airport that barely even had a plane that landed there in a year, but it was still talk about taking these opportunities on and building community through that. So.
Well, that's a very good point. A lot of people, young people now interested in the environment or economics, talk about a circular economy, the idea of things going round and round, as Kim Hudson has done. You don't hear it as much around mining, though, as an idea.
Chief Taylor's here. We'll talk about his royalty checks, right? I mean, we just know that the money, and that's how we create community, that's how we create business, is by ensuring that we don't have as much leakage as we do, because there's a lot of investors from the south that come up here during the summer months and make their money and take it all basically in a bag home. And the best points that Chief Darren had made in recent comments is that a lot of that gold is not even being disclosed in regards to where it's going, right? A lot of people are sitting, even in the city of Dawson, with their mattress lined with gold. So it just in the sense of where is all this going, we're not really sure of. Yeah. Even with the gold prices, right? Well, so it's tough.
Part of the thinking back in late 80s, early 90s that we were talking about on this subject was that as long as we continued, and we're still doing it now, bringing miners in, mine labor from Vancouver and Edmonton, who fly home at Christmas and file their tax return in Edmonton or Vancouver to the benefit of Alberta and British Columbia, we actually have tax leakage here, which is a problem for us. The other benefit, I would argue, for hiring local and training local is that I think you're going to have a much safer work site if your brother and your cousin are on the shift with you, looking after you, watching your back. Also, I would argue that if you're hiring locally, if you're hiring a Peter Johnson in a a mine near Teslin, Peter Johnson is much more likely to look after the environment and worry about the environment than someone who's just flown in from down south and knows they're going to go back in a few weeks. Yeah. Maybe I could ask you to add to that, Peter.
Well, there's just value in that
Yeah.
as well, right? And that's how do we invest back in our communities to ensure that everybody's not getting left behind. And we, unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier in the year, we looked upon as being laborers, right? And that the whole mentality is about changing us to get into senior executive positions and to be able to be some of the management team versus just being the ditch diggers and the brush cutters. And I think traditionally, you know, we've cut a lot of line in this territory, fair enough, but at the same time, we need to look at how do we ensure that our next generation have not only the education, but also the opportunities. And I think really today, a lot of the focus on the geoscience is creating this community, right? And I believe this is a community when we look at how the mining industry in the territory is looked upon, but we have to ensure that, especially young people, and it's great to see especially young women that are working in heavy machinery, and if you look at a lot of construction sites across the territory, we're starting to see this emphasis, and we've got to thank you know, the university for their women in trades programs and other things that are help building that momentum, because if we're not putting the concentrated effort, if we're not looking at the long-term vision of where we're going, and unfortunately with mining, a lot of it's sitting on your face right now, and you're just waiting to cash in your chips, let alone have the opportunity to sell the company next year. So I think some of that momentum has to change. I think in regards to processes and how people are going to be attracted to the territory, it needs to change in regards to having these fundamental steps that companies have to ensure that they're checking the boxes, not more than the First Nation procurement policy, which is another political issue. We're just, a lot of that is lipstick on a pig, unfortunately. Unfortunately, you still have this pig that is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I think once going back to government, and we're not here to pick on government, but really at the end of the day, it is the will of government to work with our people. And you know, we haven't seen a pivotal shift since I've been in politics, since the early beginnings or the late 90s. We've never had this ability to be in the same room, let alone the opportunity to create these investments. So anyways, we're 18 minutes left, and
I'm going to
poor
switch
Greg here is like...
I'm going to switch to Greg in a
Okay,
second.
thank you.
But just build on your comment about women in the mine workforce. I remember I was actually already a legislator when the first woman went underground in the Yukon Territory as an underground miner. She later became the first Red Seal carpenter in the territory. Nice. So it's not that long ago. And one of the things the mining industry up here discovered with women operators of heavy equipment, they actually, after they discovered they were much safer operators and much more careful with machinery than the guys, actually started hiring them. And anyway,
you know, it's just the intricacy, it's the level of patience, you know, compared to your grandmother, to your grandfather. I have a lot of tattoos on my arm, and the best tattoo artists are women because they take the time not only to put the detail, but also to ensure that the integrity of their work. We're male, we think from a different side of our brain in a lot of cases, right? We just want to get to that linear thinking versus, I think women have a different, and we're not, anyways, they have a different touch, if I could use that word there. But
so if you want recommendations for tattoo artists, see Peter afterwards.
Yes, there are some great ones out there. So
Greg, all my years as an MLA, I had constituents complaining about the fact that in the classroom there were only teachers who taught kids getting them ready for university. There was no one in there, with a couple of exceptions like Bob Sharp and Peter Menzies, who actually were helping prepare kids for trades, for occupations as technologists or machine operators or carpenters or plumbers. Have you seen much change in that situation in the years you've been in the education system?
I think the important piece is there has been change, but the change tends to cycle back to the system that we know, because I think education, after 37 years, the only thing I can figure out is that education is like a virus. We all went to school. It's a cultural touchstone. Everybody in this room went to school for somewhere between 6 and 20 years. So we all went through this same thing. And who are teachers? And first of all, I gotta say, I love teachers. I am a teacher. My wife's a teacher. My kids aren't gonna be teachers. They saw what it's like. It's a very, very difficult job. But who goes into teaching? We are weird. We liked school. We followed rules. The system worked for us. And then we go to university and we're taught to do the same thing that has been going on for the last 100 years or more. It's like a virus. So even when you got people that eventually see outside the box, people as brilliant as Bob Sharp, people even like myself, after 20 years of beating my head against the ground, start to realize there's a different way to do these things. You get the continual re-implementation of older ideas because it's coming from the same place all the time. And it is separating knowledge from doing. A lot of teachers don't have a trades background, don't have a background of working with their hands. So even when the ministry in BC introduces this fantastic program called ADST, Applied Design, Science and Technology, teachers don't know how to do it. And nobody's showing them how to do it. So there are lots of good examples, and I don't want to just be Debbie Downer, but there are powerful forces of conformity in the education system. And if we don't accept and realize that, we keep tinkering with a system that probably needs a major restart. And I think as time goes on, it becomes more obvious to everyone. And First Nations kids are voting with their feet. If I go to schools, if I go to rural schools, attendance is not high because it has nothing, I don't think kids see this system as having much to do with them. Mathematics, the way we teach it, I work with a lot of students. I work with a lot of students on career now. In my retirement, I'm going all over the place trying to work with career with students. And I think, honestly, some of our First Nations kids think that mathematics was invented by white people to torture them with. You've got to show them what a tape measure is and why fractions are important, and you've got to get them doing stuff, working with their hands, and this idea from First Nations of a holistic way of dealing with community and dealing with students and working with students. Stuff that Mark Wedge says about in the old days, there were fall gatherings and they used to take a look at kids and say, what is that kid? Who is that kid? What is that kid going to be good at? Who do we surround that kid with? And the things that have worked are like that. They are putting more than teachers in front of kids. Whenever I've had a really super success, like my housing project, there was a housing project in Hay River. I had a whole bunch of First Nations boys, mostly, riding their bikes around the school. And I would talk to teachers. I'd say, what are we going to do? They'd all want to blame the parents because it's a big thing. And they'd say, oh, you got to go talk to the parents. So I'd go talk to the parents. Look at this face. There is not a whiter person in Canada, and I'm going to talk to a group of parents, and I am the symbol of residential school coming to talk to them. And it was good to have those conversations because eventually you can become a person. It takes a while, but you can become a person. So it's critical to have those conversations, but the conversations have to go way beyond blame. And when we started having community meetings, we actually had people from housing say, well, what do you want to do? And I had a shop teacher said, I want to build houses instead of birdhouses. The guy, Mr. Makepeace, said, I'll give you all the funding. Well, you're going to build houses. And in Little Hay River, we started building houses. And the first year was a disaster because we didn't know what we were doing. By the second, third, and fourth year, we were building those little 512 Arctic houses for low-cost housing. We had those students, those boys, instead of driving their bikes around school, they were starting to buy into school because it seemed to mean something to them when they were working on stuff, on real things. And the more I've researched this, all the way down to San Diego High-Tech High, the only school I know of where your socioeconomic status and your cultural background doesn't mean where you're going to go in the end. Every kid, they have so many first generation Hispanic kids graduating from high school, going into universities or colleges, becoming tradespeople or whatever they need to be because they started working with teachers, tradespeople, engineers, elders, community, part of the community. That's the answer for school. The answer for school is not more of the same, is not creating the same thing we've always created, because it's a virus. We got to figure out how to do something different. So, my goodness, that's a speech I just gave, sorry.
So, Greg, let me go back. If you go some provinces, some parts of North America, but everywhere in Northern Europe, if you go to high school, you may originally be channeled into the academic stream, but you also have an option to switch into a trades alternative. I mean, I was a member in a tiny town above the Arctic Circle in Norway, where I went into its plant, huge plant, had been there for decades. Every single employee was a local hire. Why were they a local hire? Because some teacher in junior high identified the kid as that kid would be a good mechanic, or that kid might be an engineer, or that kid would actually be, and then would go to the one company, because there was really only one company there, and the company would then go to the parents and say, if you will commit, your son or daughter will commit to working for 5 years for the company after they get out of university, we'll pay 100% of the cost of their schooling. And that kind of training culture, it seems to me, has never really happened here. Has there anywhere in the three territories you've worked in seen anything like it?
It's a little bit easier in the Northwest Territories. The ease is that we work with the Alberta curriculum, and we worked with the Alberta apprenticeship. They had a program called RAP, and then it was converted into something called SNAP. It was very easy for me to have students get their hours. Here, it seems you have to invent it. So people like Peter Menzies, you mentioned, he's reinvented it. He's figured out how to do it. I was his superintendent. All I had to say to Peter, say, go for it, do it. He's also got partnerships with the Placer Miners. He's going all the way down to kindergarten because you got to start early. So that is roughly correct. If you want a Yukon model, we used to do something called REM here. So the REM was something I was probably most proud of as a superintendent. It was the rural experiential model where we realized all of these little schools, if you put all the students together in all of our rural schools, it's one really small high school. Let's bring all of these students together and let's do something interesting. And let's bring tradespeople, let's bring First Nations artists, let's bring hairdressers, let's bring all of these things that students say they don't get. Let's bring them together and we'll do a week worth of courses. And it was incredible. I was almost like the principal of first 4 or 5 REMs, and I would hear comments like this, you know, if school was like this at home, I might actually go. A girl talking to another girl beside her. And I used to think, yeah. And the umbrella effect of that would last for 2 or 3 weeks at the end of the REM. They'd come back to school, they'd give her, and then eventually the virus would take over and they'd stop coming to school. And I was a rural superintendent. I got to know all these students, so I was very hurt by that. I knew we needed to do more things like that, and COVID happens. What gets crossed off the list? There's no more REM. Something like that needs to come back. We could start small with those sorts of models. But, and right south of us in BC, there are many of those school boards, and the school boards seem to be the answer. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the First Nations School Board evolves here, because they can be faster, they can turn on a dime more, they can be less bureaucratic. So what you've got in school boards since 2008, when the Minister of Education in BC said, get her done, they created all of these procedures that work together, and they have a lot of boards have these amazing industry and university partnerships where they have major investment from industry, and it's all aimed at students and trades, and you don't have to go very far away to see those sorts of things happen. We could do all of that here. We could do it better here.
In your leadership role in education, have you ever had a really extensive dialogue with anybody in the mining industry about connections there or possibilities, training possibilities for kids who might have a career in that field?
You know, I hate to be honest, but I'll be honest. As my career, the 10 years I spent here as a superintendent, I will always consider that the darkest time of my entire career. Because for whatever reason, the Yukon has adopted this bureaucratic model that there's 190 people working at the Department of Education. I used to work there, even when I worked there, I didn't know what everybody did. I know when the sandwich lady came that there was a whole bunch of people waiting for the sandwich lady. And as we kept adding layers of bureaucracy, people would say, oh, those people are there to help you. No, they weren't. They were there to create their own little kingdom. So pretty soon, it seemed to me like the whole Department of Education was full of these little kingdoms, and many of those kingdoms were led by people who weren't even educators. So I don't mean to bash anybody, but the system we have here, I think, I wouldn't want to see it replicated anywhere else. So that's where I think going to things like a school board, which is small and can turn on a dime, is the only way to go. You got to get out of the bureaucracy into the how do we serve children. And in the old days, when Bob Sharp was a superintendent, Bob Sharp could do stuff like right away. I felt like I never could. I never had finances. I never had anybody working with me. And I always felt like I was enmeshed like a bug in a whole series of bureaucratic circles. So I didn't plan to say that when I came here. But I'm semi-retired. What are they going to do, fire me? They can, I'm safe. But something has to change here.
So what I'm going to do is ask Peter now if he would like to comment on anything that Greg has said, and I'll offer 1 or 2 minutes wrap-up comment if I can.
No, and I appreciate that he brought up the REM program because
Yeah.
I think that was a success, and I didn't realize that COVID really shut it down. But I think there is opportunities for us to have that engagement, and I think there are people in this room that are trying to help build capacity within communities. And it's not just learning hands-on trades in regards to the industries, but it's also the art of negotiation, which I think is very important to how we can move beyond, as you mentioned, with the school board and other mechanisms that we have now to help create a more fulfilling lifestyle here in the territory, if you will. And education, go back to, it hasn't really been that great of a process. And I speak a lot at the schools, and trust me, it's not even only the Indian kids that aren't inspired every day. It's most of the class that are not even invigorated by going to the school. And I think if we can change those into experiences versus having to go through these processes that don't even meet our needs, let alone reflect on who we are, the more success that we're going to have in the long term. So I think being creative, less bureaucracy, more rockeracy, you know what I mean? Like, we can make shit happen here. So.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
I'm just going to wrap up by saying, because of disappointment with what government is doing, actually what government's not doing, some of us, and Peter and Greg both know about this, have been, as private citizens, again, retirees and so forth, have been talking to each other about this problem, about how we can bring some life into 22-4-22, how we can animate it. And Peter's talked about what he's prepared to do, and Greg's talked about what he is doing. We have actually put together a sort of pamphlet of a number of people, including a former president of the World Mining Council, who actually used to be, dare I say this, sort of an environmental hippie 30 years ago in the Yukon. 30 years ago in the Yukon. And Piers MacDonald, who was an underground miner, Ted Hupe, who was like Greg's very strong views on experiential learning, and others, to try and start a conversation by passing this document around and have people add to it. Because sometimes if things aren't happening in government, you have to animate the conversation outside of government to actually trigger some activity. And that's what we're doing. I'm not going to hand out the pamphlet to people who've been the blockers over the last 30 years, but anybody who's seriously interested in working with us as volunteers to try and make some of the changes that both Peter and Greg have talked about, come and see me afterwards, okay? Are there any questions? We only have a couple of minutes, but if there's anybody got a question, there's someone, a Tahltan person here I saw, I thought had a question. Please.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Because what you said about going to school to university, then they teach what they have never experienced anything like out in school. Exactly what one of my professors told me about 33 years ago
Yeah.
in a different country. And here we are saying, would it help to make all teaching students go out and force them to do a 3-year apprenticeship or whatever? Like, do you think that would help?
Greg, do you want to go to that?
Yeah, I actually have, as I've semi-retired, I've had all this time to reflect, and I'm thinking I've done a lot of work now with apprenticeship, with the university, with trades. I kind of think that's the way to go, is to have more of an apprenticeship model. But that apprenticeship model should be deeper, because if you put a teacher in a classroom, if you apprentice in a school, well, the school is the virus again. So that apprenticeship has to be like, I would say, what do we want? What is an educated person? What can an educated person do? And I've thought a lot after working with elders and people who could actually do things like my father. An educated person should be able to weld, they should be able to design, they should be able to put stuff together, they should be able to do carpentry, they should be able to do trigonometry, they should be able to do biology, they should be able to do all of these things. And what we tend to do in education, I think, is have way too thin a slice of skills. And you know, the terrible thing about it is, as we learn more about the science of reading, I think a lot of teachers don't even know how to teach reading. So what are they learning in universities? Not enough. I think the whole system needs to be re-looked at. And it's interesting that we're having these conversations with Yukon University. What does an educated person look like? What does a teacher look like? If a teacher is going to be a lead educator, what does that look like? And as well as all those cultural aspects. How do you figure out how to bring some of those cultural aspects? The only way to do it is to live it. And then to live it, you can then share it.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Greg.
yes.
Thank you, Peter.
So yes, just want to say thank you very much for your time, insights, great comments, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of people that want to talk to you. Unfortunately, we have to move on to the next panel, but I'm sure you will all be around and happy to speak to people later. So thank you very much, and we're going to go on to the next session.